Today's story starts, as the best ones often do, with someone digging in the ground somewhere they probably shouldn't be, on top of a volcano in Argentina, at 22,000 feet above sea level. And what they found there has been making scientists go very, very quiet ever since. Hi guys, this channel runs on one simple belief. History is the best entertainment humans ever accidentally created. Nobody sat down and wrote it. Nobody hired a writer's room. It just happened. Messy, bizarre, heartbreaking, occasionally unhinged. And then real people had to live inside it. Now find a comfortable position, close your eyes if you want, and let the story come to you. And tonight, somewhere else is 500 years back, 12,000 feet up, on a volcano on the Argentina-Chile border, where 3 Inca children have been waiting, perfectly and impossibly preserved, for someone to come and find them. Imagine you're a scientist. You've spent years digging through dirt, studying broken pots, translating half-destroyed texts. You have a PhD. You have calluses on your hands. You have probably a thermos of bad coffee. And then one day, on top of a volcano in Argentina, 22,000 feet above sea level, a place where the air has literally half the oxygen of where you're standing right now, someone calls out. Not in an excited, we found a cool rock way, in a hushed way, in a we need to lower our voices because she might wake up kind of way. Because what they found wasn't a skeleton. It wasn't dust. It wasn't the pile of old fabric you'd expect after 5 centuries underground. It was a girl of around 13 years old, seated, perfectly still, perfectly preserved. The girl selected was not chosen for being ordinary. She was chosen for her charisma, her calm, her purity, her beauty. She was given a place of higher ceremony before the emperor himself. She was celebrated through towns. She was dressed in the finest clothes ever made. In the Quechua language, the language of the Inca, there is no word for sacrifice. The word is offering. The logic was this: the earth gives you everything: life, food, rain, harvest. What can you give back in gratitude that equals that? Only the most precious thing you have, which for the Inca was the purity of a child. Does that make it easier to understand? Maybe. Does it make it easier to feel? Not really. Because she was still 14. She still walked 1,000 miles. And she still knew with every step where she was going. Let's reconstruct her final hours. We're at the summit of Lula-Ilaco. It's before dawn. It is bitterly, fatally cold. The priests are there. They've climbed with her, built a small tomb, prepared everything. First, the alcohol. Chicha is a fermented corn beer. It was the sacred drink of the Inca, used in ceremonies, offered to the gods, consumed in ritual. A chicha cup was found intact in her tomb, and toxicology analysis of her hair and tissues confirmed she had high levels of alcohol in her system. Dr. Andrew Wilson described the effect carefully. The alcohol would have had a sedating effect. Combined with the coca leaves, which she was already regularly consuming, it would have created something close to a dreamlike state, dissociated from her surroundings, calm, perhaps even hallucinating gently. The investigators believe this was deliberate, not cruelty, control, a way of easing her transition, a way of making her peaceful for what came next. Her braids, which are tight, intricate, and clearly very recently woven, were probably done that morning by women who specialized in this while she was being prepared. Red pigment, ritual paint, was on her cheeks. She was dressed in her finest clothes. Her headdress was placed on her head. Her coca leaves were tucked into her cheek. And then, at sunrise, timed to the December solstice when the days begin growing longer and the sun returns in force, the ceremony happened. But here's the thing. Even with all of this context, Dr. Shepherd still needed to answer the question at the center of everything. How specifically did she die? He ruled out violence, no injuries on her body. He ruled out hypothermia, no markers in her tissues. He ruled out burial alive, no signs of struggle, no damage to her fingers or nails, no disturbed tomb. He ruled out strangulation, no damage to the cartilage of her throat. So what was left? Reinhardt, who was one of the first people to examine her on the mountain, remembered something. The first thing he had to remove from her body when they found her was a thick woolen cloth pulled over her entire head and knotted tightly at the back. He described it simply. Once you have cloth wrapped around your head and in your mouth at 22,000 feet, you're out of breath immediately. At over 22,000 feet, there's already 50% less oxygen in the air than at sea level. She was already heavily sedated, alcohol, coca, altitude. In that state, at that altitude, it wouldn't take much. A cloth over the face, tied gently, and she would have simply drifted away. Dr. Shepherd's conclusion, and it's a hypothesis, not a confirmed verdict, because the official cause of death remains unknown, was suffocation. Quiet, peaceful, probably unfelt. We've talked about who the maiden was. We've talked about what happened to her. But here's the thing, to really understand her story, to understand why a civilization sent a 13-year-old girl up a volcano, you need to understand what daily life actually looked like in the Inca Empire. Not the temples, not the gold, not the drama, the everyday. Because the maiden didn't come from nowhere. She came from a society, a very specific, very peculiar, extraordinarily organized society that functioned in ways that would make most modern economists either very impressed or mildly horrified. Possibly both. Let's start at the bottom, because that's what almost everyone was. The foundation of Inca society wasn't the individual. It wasn't even the fam. Samely in the way we'd recognize it. It was something called the Ailu. An Ailu was an extended kinship group. Imagine a large clan of families who share a common ancestor, live together, work together, own land together, and are collectively responsible for each other. Every single person in the empire belonged to one. You were born into your Ailu. You worked for your Ailu. You married someone from the right kind of Ailu. And eventually you died within your Ailu, and your Ailu continued to exist around you. Because here's where it gets interesting. The Inca didn't exactly believe in the dead being gone. Deceased ancestors were wrapped up, mummified, brought out for festivals, offered food and drink, consulted on important decisions. Your dead grandfather might literally attend your wedding, which is either beautiful or deeply unsettling, depending on your relationship with your grandfather. Each Ailu had a leader called a curaca, a local governor essentially. The curaca knew everyone's name, everyone's occupation, everyone's land allocation. He settled disputes, organized labor, made sure the sick were cared for, and here's a detail that really sums up how controlled this society was. He even chose brides for unmarried men. If you were a young man who reached his 20s without finding a wife, the curaca would find one for you. You had to marry her. No swiping left. The Inca Empire ran without money, no coins, no currency, no cash economy. This is one of the most genuinely unusual things about them. Every other large civilization, Roman, Chinese, Mesopotamian, eventually developed some form of money. The Inca just didn't. They looked at the concept and apparently decided they had better things to do. Instead, they ran on labor. The system was called mita, a rotational labor tax. Every able-bodied man between the ages of roughly 15 and 50 owed the state a portion of his time each year. Could be a few weeks, could be several months, depending on what was needed. What did you do during your mita, whatever the empire needed? You might be assigned to road building, or carrying goods along those roads, or mining gold in the mountains, or working on a temple, or serving in the army, or farming state-owned fields. You didn't get paid in money. The state fed you, clothed you, and housed you while you worked. When you were done, you went home. Next year, you'd be called again. On paper, this sounds like forced labor, and in some ways it was. But there's a nuance here. The Inca system was built on a principle called aini, reciprocity. You work for the state works for you. The empire maintained massive storehouses across its territory, kolkar, filled with food, textiles, tools, and weapons. In times of drought or disaster, those stores were opened and goods redistributed to the people who needed them. It was simultaneously a labor tax and a social safety net. Nobody in the Inca Empire went hungry. That's not a romantic idealization. It's historically documented. The storage network was so extensive that even in bad years, famine was rare. The Spanish were genuinely stunned by this when they arrived. They had never seen anything like it. Of course, the Spanish then systematically dismantled it. But that's the next chapter. Most people in the Inca Empire were farmers. Not some people, not many people, most people. The entire economic superstructure rested on the shoulders of agricultural workers who got up at dawn, farmed until dark, and did it again the next day. Their homes were simple. Adobe brick walls, thatched roofs, a single room. No windows. Not because they couldn't build windows, but because windows meant heat loss and the Andes are cold. One door covered with a piece of woven cloth or leather. Inside, a small stove, some baskets for storage, thin sleeping mats on the floor. That was essentially it. The family slept together in that one room, cooked together, ate together, worked together. The concept of privacy as we understand it. Your own bedroom, your own space, simply didn't exist for ordinary Inca people. What did they eat? Primarily potatoes. The Inca invented, or rather developed, the potato as a major food crop. They cultivated hundreds of varieties suited to different altitudes and climates. If you visit the Andes today, you can still find potato varieties that haven't changed in 500 years. They also ate quinoa, which the world recently rediscovered and immediately started charging $8 a bag for. The Inca were eating it for breakfast 600 years ago. Maize, corn, was there too, but mostly as a ritual crop and for making chicha, the sacred beer, the one that was in the maiden's stomach. Meat was a luxury, guinea pig on special occasions, llama sometimes, fish if you lived near the coast or a river. For most commoners, most of the time, it was vegetables, nutritious, filling, adequate vegetables. 2 meals a day, that was the standard. And traveling? Forget it. Commoners were not allowed to use the roads, those beautifully engineered, carefully maintained roads that the Inca built across their entire empire. Off limits to ordinary people. If a commoner was caught on the roads without permission, they were to be thrown off the nearest mountain. The roads were strictly reserved for chasqui, military, officials, and goods in transit. The inspectors, called tokoirikok, which translates with magnificent directness as he who sees all, made regular rounds to ensure everyone was working, everyone was in order, and everyone's house was clean. Yes, the government checked whether your house was tidy. The Inca made the HOA look relaxed. In the Inca Empire, clothing wasn't fashion, it was information. What you wore told everyone around you precisely who you were. Your social class, your regional origin, your marital status, your occupation. The Inca were essentially walking around in a society where everyone's LinkedIn profile was visible on their body. Commoners wore the coarsest cloth, a rough woven fabric called a vasco made from llama or alpaca wool. Practical, warm, functional. Men wore knee-length tunics, women wore long dresses. Both added ponchos or capes in cold weather. No colors beyond what was naturally available. No decoration beyond what your status permitted. Wear the wrong color, wear the wrong weave, wear something above your station. And you'd hear about it very quickly from whoever was watching. Nobles wore kumbi, a finer, more densely woven cloth, often with color and pattern woven in. The weaving itself was extraordinarily complex. Some Inca textiles were so tightly woven that they contained more threads per inch than the finest modern fabrics. The Spanish, who looted everything, were reportedly more interested in the textiles than the gold, and the very finest cloth of all. The cloth, woven for the emperor, was made partly from vampire bat hair. This is a true fact. The Sapa Inca Atahualpa reportedly commissioned a headdress band woven from vampire bat hair. Because when you are the son of the sun and the ruler of the world's largest empire, apparently regular fabric just doesn't communicate your status adequately. Hairstyles also mattered enormously. The style of your hair told people which Alu you belonged to, which region you came from, and what your position in society was. Noblemen wore large gold earplugs that started small and grew larger over time. The weight of the plug literally stretched the earlobe over years, creating the distinctive elongated ears you see in Inca portraits. The Spanish called them orellones, big ears. They meant it as an insult. The Inca probably didn't care. Here's something the Inca did that genuinely deserves more credit. They invented freeze-drying. Not a metaphor, not a loose approximation. Actual freeze-drying. The same principle used in modern food preservation and pharmaceutical manufacturing was developed in the Andes hundreds of years before anyone in Europe had the vaguest idea it was possible. The process worked like this. You take potatoes, the crop that forms the backbone of the Andean diet, and you leave them outside overnight in the high-altitude cold. The temperature drops below freezing. The potatoes freeze solid. During the day, the intense Andean sun causes the surface ice to sublimate, go directly from solid to vapor. You repeat this for several days. What you're left with is chuno, a completely dehydrated, freeze-dried potato that weighs almost nothing, lasts for years, maybe decades, and can be reconstituted with water into a perfectly edible meal. The Inca stored chuno by the millions in their colca storehouses. They also freeze-dried llama meat using the same principle. Combined, these products gave them a food supply that could outlast any drought, any flood, any disaster. The same chuno and freeze-dried llama meat that showed up in the maiden's hair analysis. Her elite traveler's diet was essentially the Inca version of very sophisticated camping food. The storehouses themselves were architectural achievements, built in rows at slightly elevated positions to maximize air circulation, with carefully controlled ventilation. Some were designed for cold storage, positioned on north-facing slopes where they'd stay cool, and others for dry storage. Different foods got different storehouses. This wasn't just feeding people. This was logistics infrastructure. The Inca could move armies across their empire and know that food would be waiting at every major point along the road network. No supply lines required. The supply lines were already built. The Inca didn't have flat land. They had mountains, steep, dramatic, beautiful, thoroughly impractical mountains that most sensible civilizations would have looked at and said, "We'll farm somewhere else, thanks." The Inca looked at those mountains and said, "Hold our chicha." They built terraces, massive engineered stone-walled steps carved into the mountainsides, transforming near vertical slopes into level agricultural land. These aren't small walls. Some Inca terraces are still standing today, and you look at them and genuinely wonder how human beings without machinery built them. Each terrace was its own engineered system. Drainage channels to prevent waterlogging, soil composition carefully chosen for the specific crop being grown, irrigation channels running from mountain springs above. The Inca understood something that modern agriculture is only now fully grasping: vertical diversity. Different altitudes produce different climates, different temperatures, different growing conditions. A single Alu with land at 3 different elevations could grow potatoes at 4,000 meters, maize at 2,500 meters, and tropical fruits in the lowland valleys. They called this the vertical archipelago, controlling a chain of ecological zones from the highlands to the coast like islands in a vertical sea. They also used fertilizer, dried llama dung, guano from coastal seabird colonies, transported hundreds of miles inland, fish heads buried in fields, regular crop rotation to prevent soil depletion. These aren't primitive practices. They're sustainable farming techniques that modern organic agriculture is actively trying to revive. And the irrigation. The Inca built canals, aqueducts, and reservoirs that channeled water from mountain springs to fields miles away. Some of these aqueducts were so well engineered that they're still functional today. Andean farmers still use Inca-built water channels 500 years later. In total, the Inca cultivated over 70 types of crops, hundreds of varieties of potato alone, more varieties of maize than most people knew existed, plus quinoa, beans, peppers, squash, peanuts, tomatoes, avocados, pineapple, coca. They also kept guinea pigs, not as pets, as livestock. Small, easy to maintain, require no pasture, breed rapidly, and provide protein. If you've ever wondered why Peruvians still eat guinea pig today, this is why. It's a 500-year-old protein strategy that still makes perfect sense. In the Inca Empire, children were not left to wander around being children for very long. The system had plans for them from almost birth. When a baby was born, its arms were bound tightly to its body for the first 3 months. The Inca believed this made children stronger. Whether or not it worked, it certainly established from day one that you were part of a structured society that had opinions about your body. At age 2, a child was formally named in a ceremony and considered to have left infancy. From that point, children were expected to help around the house. Small tasks at first, carrying water, herding animals, picking crops, but help they did. At 13, boys in noble families went to school in Cusco. 4 years of education, highly specific. First year, Quechua language. Second year, Inca religion. Third year, the Quipu. Fourth year, history and leadership. After those 4 years, they graduated into the administrative class. Girls from noble families. And this brings us back to something relevant. Were assessed at the age of puberty by local officials. If they showed promise of intelligence, beauty, weaving skill, they could be selected for the Aklawasi, the house of the chosen women. These were the girls who became sun virgins, who became priestesses, who became royal wives, and who, very occasionally, became something else entirely. Commoner children had a different trajectory. They learned their parents' trade. Farming families produced farming children. Potter families produced potter children. Weaver families produced weaver children. Social mobility in the Inca Empire was tightly controlled. The system preferred people to stay where they were born and do what their elu had always done. And if a commoner boy reached the age of 20 without marrying, the Caracas stepped in. A wife was chosen. The marriage happened, non-negotiable. No one aged out of the system. The system had a slot for everyone, and everyone filled their slot. The Inca had laws, many laws, clear laws, and the punishments for breaking them were, let's say, motivating. Murder, execution, stealing, amputation of the hands, cheating on your taxes, execution, cursing the gods, execution. Being a commoner caught on the imperial roads, thrown off a mountain. Notice a theme. The Inca legal system was not built around rehabilitation. It was built around deterrence. Crime rates in the empire were, by all historical accounts, extremely low. Possibly because the consequences were sufficiently dramatic that most people simply decided not to. There were no prisons in the Inca Empire, no long-term incarceration. If you committed a serious crime, the punishment was immediate and final. If you committed a minor infraction, you might be publicly shamed, have your rations reduced, or be reassigned to more unpleasant labor. The inspectors, the Tokoirakok, he who sees all, were everywhere. They checked that your house was clean, they checked that you were working, they checked that your meter obligations were met. They reported directly to higher officials, who reported to the governor, who reported to Cusco. It was an empire held together by a very sophisticated surveillance system and the knowledge that consequences were swift and severe. It sounds grim, and in some ways it was. But it also produced something remarkable, a society where virtually no one went hungry, almost no one was homeless, everyone had work, and the infrastructure was the envy of contemporary civilizations. Whether the trade-off was worth it is a question the people living under it didn't exactly get to vote on. While commoners were sleeping on mats and eating potatoes in one-room houses, The Inca nobility was living rather differently. Nobles lived in stone houses in Cusco. Stone, not adobe, actual carved stone fitted together with such precision that no mortar was needed. You cannot slide a piece of paper between the stones in some Inca walls. The engineering is so good that many of these walls survived earthquakes that destroyed everything built on top of them by the Spanish centuries later. Nobles wore cumbi cloth, the finest textiles. They had servants. They were exempt from the meter labor tax. They ate meat regularly, a luxury essentially unavailable to commoners, and they could have multiple wives, while commoners were strictly limited to one. The Sapa Inca himself lived in an entirely different category. His clothes were burned after wearing them once and never worn twice. He ate from the gold and silver dishes. He was carried everywhere in a litter because the ground was not considered an appropriate surface for his feet. His food was prepared by specially chosen women, the leftovers. Whatever he didn't eat were carefully collected and burned. Nothing that had touched the emperor's mouth could remain in the ordinary world. When the Sapa Inca died, his body was mummified and preserved. His royal household, his wives, his servants, continued to serve him as if he were alive. His mummy was brought to important ceremonies. State decisions were made in his presence. His descendants managed his lands and spoke on his behalf. This meant that every deceased emperor continued to own his palace and his estates. Each new emperor had to build a new palace from scratch because all the old ones were still occupied, which is how you end up with a city full of royal palaces all simultaneously maintained for mummies. Machu Picchu, many historians now believe, was one of these royal estates. Not a city, not a fortress, a personal retreat, the vacation home of a deceased emperor maintained by his household long after his death, which makes the famous Misty Mountain hideaway considerably weirder and considerably more interesting. Religion in the Inca Empire wasn't something you did on specific holy days. It was something you did constantly. The entire agricultural calendar was a religious calendar. Every planting, every harvest, every major civic event had a ritual component. There were at least 15 major festivals per year. Some lasted multiple days. They involved processions, offerings, feasting, chicha drinking, music, dancing. The state provided food and drink for all attendees. This was one of the ways the empire maintained popular loyalty. You showed up for the festival, the state fed you. Everyone went home full and vaguely satisfied with the arrangement. The Inca worshipped a whole pantheon. Inti, the sun god, was primary. The divine ancestor of the emperor, Pachamama, the earth mother, was essential for agriculture. Ilapa, the thunder god, controlled weather. Supe ruled the underworld. But here's the interesting part. When the Inca conquered a new people, they didn't demand those people abandon their local gods. They demanded something more subtle, that those local gods be recognized as subordinate to Inti. Your god can stay. He just has to acknowledge that Inti is better. This made religious absorption much smoother than outright prohibition. The conquered people could still worship at their shrines. They could still practice their rituals. They just had to add Inti to the top of the hierarchy and send their most promising girls to Cusco. It was imperialism with excellent PR management. The physical religious infrastructure was extraordinary. Cusco's Coricancha, the courtyard of gold, was the most sacred space in the empire. Its walls were lined with sheets of gold. Life-size golden cornstalks grew from the floor. Golden llamas stood in the courtyard. The entire complex glittered so intensely in sunlight that eyewitness accounts, admittedly written by people who then melted all the gold down, describe people being temporarily blinded. The Spanish stripped it bare within months of arriving, built a Catholic church on top of it. You can still see the original Inca walls at the base. They survived every earthquake that toppled the Spanish building above them. Let's talk about one of the most fascinating and still not fully understood objects in human history, the quipu. The Inca had no written language, no alphabet, no syllabary, no hieroglyphics. And yet they ran an empire of millions of people, tracked census data, recorded tax payments, maintained histories, and sent messages across thousands of miles. They did all of this with knotted strings. A quipu is a main cord from which hang dozens, sometimes hundreds of subsidiary strings. Each string can be a different color. Each string can have knots tied at different positions, in different styles, in different quantities. The color of the cord matters. The direction of the knot matters. The position on the string matters. The spacing between knots matters. The combinations are essentially infinite. We know Quipus recorded numerical data. Census figures, storeroom inventories, tribute amounts. The numerical system is now understood, but many historians believe Quipus also recorded narrative information. Histories, stories, ritual knowledge in a way we haven't been able to decode yet. Think about what that means. There may be the entire history of the Inca Empire. Their stories, their beliefs, their records of events, encoded in knotted strings that are sitting in museum collections right now, completely unread. The Rosetta Stone moment for Quipus hasn't happened yet. It might still happen. Several researchers are currently working on computational analysis of Quipu patterns, looking for systematic structures that might unlock the narrative information. A civilization that built Machu Picchu and freeze-dried potatoes and ran the largest empire in pre-Columbian history almost certainly had things to say. We just can't hear them yet. The Inca Empire lasted roughly a century, from its rapid expansion under Sapa Inca Pachacuti in the 1430s to its destruction by Francisco Pizarro in the 1530s. 1 century. That's it. The ending was, and there's no other word for it, a catastrophe of timing. Just before the Spanish arrived, the Inca Empire had gone through a devastating civil war. 2 brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar, both claimed the throne after their father died of disease. The disease itself was smallpox, which had arrived from Spanish settlements in the Caribbean and raced ahead of the conquistadors, killing an estimated 50 to 90% of some populations before a single European soldier set foot in the Andes. The empire that Pizarro encountered in 1532 was not the Inca Empire at its peak. It was a civilization already traumatized, already half destroyed, already deeply divided between 2 rival factions. Pizarro brought 168 men, 168, against an empire of millions. He won anyway, partly through military technology, partly through disease that had already done most of the work, and partly through one of history's most audacious gambles, capturing the Emperor Atahualpa at a meeting that was supposed to be diplomatic. Atahualpa offered to fill a room with gold in exchange for his release. The room was 22 feet long and 17 feet wide. He would fill it once with gold and twice with silver. The Incas spent months stripping temples, melting ornaments, transporting treasures. They filled the room. Pizarro executed Atahualpa anyway. The gold was melted down, the temples were stripped, the storage network was dismantled, the road system fell into disrepair. The Quipu keepers were killed or converted. The sun virgins were assigned to Spanish soldiers or forced into convents. The sacred mummies were burned, including the mummified emperors who had been maintained for generations. In about 40 years, one of the most sophisticated civilizations ever built was reduced to rubble and forced labor in its own territory. The Spanish then took the meter system, the rotational labor tax that had built roads and temples and terraces, and repurposed it. Now it meant forced labor in silver mines, mostly in Potosi, in modern-day Bolivia, where an estimated 8 million people died over the following centuries mining silver that went straight to Europe. The same system, completely different purpose, the difference between a social contract and a death sentence. Here's what's remarkable. The Spanish conquest didn't end the Inca, it ended the Inca state, but the people, the Quechua-speaking peoples of the Andes, survived. Their descendants are still there. They still farm terraces. They still herd llamas. They still weave the most extraordinary textiles. They still make chicha. In some remote Andean communities, the concept of mitite, communal labor for shared benefit, still operates. If a road needs fixing or a building needs repairing, the community comes together and does it collectively without payment as a shared obligation. The Inca Empire fell 5 centuries ago. The ideas that made it work are still being lived by its descendants. And somewhere in a museum in Salta, Argentina, A 13-year-old girl who grew up in this world is preserved more perfectly than anything else from her civilization. The emperor's palaces are ruins. The Coricancha is stripped bare. The keepers are unread. The chasqui are gone. But she's still there. Every cell intact. Every braid in place. The coca leaves still tucked into her cheek. The one artifact from the Inca Empire that the Spanish couldn't reach, couldn't melt down, couldn't convert or conscript or destroy. Because she was already on a mountain. Already exactly where she was supposed to be. The empire she came from is gone. The world she knew is gone. The language her Caraca spoke to her. The prayers she recited in the Aklawasi. The name her mother called her. All of it gone. But she stayed. She outlasted all of it. Still seated, still sleeping, still perfect. 500 years and counting.